Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Boards of Canada, Inferno. Well, Boards of Canada came back. This still doesn't entirely feel real. I'm not gonna bother introducing these guys. There's frankly a much higher likelihood that people watching this don't know who I am rather than don't know who Boards of Canada are. So hi, my name's Tommy. This is a music review channel I've been keeping up for over a full decade now, exclusively centered around electronic music. I have technically done reviews of all the old Boards of Canada albums, and a link to the playlist of all the videos I've done on them can be found in the description, although the vast majority of those videos are super old and awkward and bad and coming up on a decade old themselves. If you want a watchable version of my thoughts on these guys, I'd recommend just watching the video I made last year as part of the channel's 10-year anniversary, which was an hour-and-a-half ranking and breakdown of all the Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada albums together in one video, including several of their side projects. I'll put a card up there or something. But anyway, these guys are back with their first new music in 13 years, and seeing its announcement felt like witnessing a meteorite impact in my backyard. As the quietest act of the Warp Records Big Four, both in terms of the actual content of their music and their release schedule, I'd had this image in my head that these guys were content to live some kind of hermit lifestyle where they just racked up infinite money from the classics they put out decades ago. They do have the unique benefit of commanding a rabidly obsessed fan base who will keep them relevant for all of eternity even when they don't do anything for extremely long periods of time. They're so popular as to have loads of surface-level fans who seem to have just discovered with the release of this album that electronic music is an entire genre that exists. And any Boards of Canada related content I put out is guaranteed to get way more attention than any of the videos I regularly upload to this channel about other electronic artists whose names are not Aphex Twin, Outtaker, or Daft Punk. And like the latter acts, they have the even more unusual privilege that their lack of output drives a lot of mystique. I could have posted a Q&A announcement at any point in the time over the last several years, and the first question that people would immediately ask me is, when do you think Boards of Canada are coming back? And I mean, I'll be honest, the only reason the idea of them coming back even crossed my mind was because people ask me about it so frequently, even on videos that have nothing to do with Boards of Canada. My thought had always been, do they need to come back? They almost certainly don't need the money. They're probably enjoying their privacy away from the spotlight, and they haven't done anything to embarrass themselves or water down their legacy like everything Aphex Twin's done after Cyro. If people are really hungering for more, they could, go out and explore new artists they haven't heard before. Not that I completely blame the people who claim nothing in the world compares to BOC. I may disagree, but at least unlike Aphex Twin, who's been so copied to death to the point where being influenced by him or the styles he popularized has lost nearly all meaning, Boards of Canada do still have a particular unique style that isn't quite comparable to any other names on the scene. And while they still have absolute tons of copycats, see many artists in the lo-fi beats to study to scene, or especially any spookier variations thereof, I feel like the vaporwave scene has a lot of artists that try to follow their lineage too. Certainly anyone who tags their sound as hauntological. But when someone is directly inspired by Boards of Canada, it's always super obvious. When I see a new artist so much as break up their album with minute-long minimal synth interludes, my first thought will be that they almost certainly thought to do that because of Boards of Canada. BOC may have been hit by the IDM label early on purely because they signed to Warp Records in the 90s and were marketed directly to the same audiences as those of Aphex Twin and Outtaker. But I personally don't really consider BOC to fit in that subgenre in the same way. When I use the term IDM, there's a specific kind of sound and approach I have in mind. I think it's stuff that's a lot glitchier and more abstract, experimenting with the structures and sound palettes of classic dance music like techno and house to make something more off-kilter and strange and not really meant to be danced to. I once saw an EP by Rob Clouth have the tag irregular dance music, and I kinda wish that had caught on as what the acronym ought to actually stand for, as to not be attached to some nonsense about intelligence or whatever. But BOC's style isn't really like that. They're more like halfway between a pastiche of Berlin school synth artists of the 70s combined with instrumental hip-hop, and maybe a tiny bit of dub thrown in every now and then. These guys owe just as much to Cluster and Tangerine Dream as they do to, like, DJ Premier and Q-Tip. And they have more in common with those kinds of influences than they do to stuff like Confield or the Richard D. James album. Also, their album The Campfire Head Phase brought in a whole bunch of guitars to add in some electroacoustic and post-rock influences to the mix for good measure. So, when more surface-level fans talk about how other artists can't even compare to BOC, I mean, they're not technically wrong. There's lots of artists who have part of their style in common, but not all of those things in common, unless they're directly trying to copy their style. The very particular blend of influences BOC have in totality isn't something you can get as easily elsewhere. Like, there's a gazillion ambient techno albums out there that sound just like Selected Ambient Works 8592, but there's way fewer albums out there that sound like GeoGaddy. So, as many surface-level fans as BOC have, I do get exactly why those people talk about them in the terms they do, and I don't think they're entirely off base. But anyway, I was still perfectly content having the entire world of electronic music to fill me up instead of sitting around and waiting for that one mega popular duo who never do anything to break their 13-year silence. I love Boards of Canada as much as the next guy, but there's lots more to the genre than just them, and they're far from being like one of my personal top favorite artists of all time or anything. They may not have any projects I don't like, but they only have one album I consider like a 9 out of 10 big personal all-time favorites in their debut Music Is the Right to Children. GeoGaddy is close, also great to bordering on excellent, but that's in like the mid-higher 8 out of 10 range for me, not a 9. And Campfire Head Phase and Tomorrow's Harvest are both good in the 7 out of 10 range for me. So yeah, all this is to say, I was perfectly fine with Boards of Canada being gone for all this time. If they don't have anything of substance to add to the conversation all these years after their prime, then perhaps not releasing anything is ultimately for the best. Leave their catalog to be small but all-around solid. Unless they actually do release something, I guess. Needless to say, I was not mentally prepared for this comeback to actually happen. I'd moved on from them in my head years ago, but now suddenly all the stars have aligned and they have a whole ass set of 18 new tracks adding up to 70 minutes of music. Now, there was a part of me back when the rollout first started and the VHS tapes were circulating and stuff that had me wondering, is this actually going to be worth it? I did like the Tape 05 teaser they dropped, now called Deep Time, and especially the way it included some strings and orchestral elements in its back half. But when taken purely on its own, out of context, it wasn't the kind of thing that had me, like, absolutely mind-blown. I couldn't even tell whether it was supposed to be, like, a core track or an interlude. It kind of felt like it was sitting somewhere in between, I guess. It served as a confirmation that these guys were releasing new music and that it would sound like Boards of Canada, but that's all I could really glean from it. These guys could just release another album that sounds exactly like Tomorrow's Harvest again, and it would have gotten the exact same level of hype and rapturous fan acclaim for the simple reason of Boards of Canada releasing any new music at all. But that doesn't mean it was going to have that strong an impact on me. However, the more we found out about the album and the more we heard from it, the more actually excited I got for what we were about to hear. This didn't look like it was just going to be some shallow nostalgia trip, revealing an album title like Inferno along with a track listing that featured such titles as The Word Becomes Flesh, Blood in the Labyrinth, All Reason Departs, or Arena Americanada, along with really doubling down heavy on the cult imagery that they hadn't focused on in the same way since GeoGaddy. Almost as if to tell people that, no, they haven't actually gone off and isolated themselves in some beautiful place out in the country for all this time. They know what's going on in our real-life society and have feelings to express about just how bad the state of the world has gotten over the past 13 years, even if expressing them in their usual abstract and obtuse way. And that feeling really got cemented when they released the proper lead single to this album, the album opener, Prophecy at 1420 MHz. When this track dropped, that was when I was like, okay, I'm properly excited for this one now. This track was like a combination of what they did on Dave and Cowboy with the old GeoGaddy style. foreboding pads and tribal beatwork in the intro suddenly paying off into this impressively intense drop with all these heavy, mildly 80s flavored guitars and drums, aggressively pitched down vocal samples talking about God, the ultimate resonance, and various big cinematic synth washes. When those beats and guitars first hit, I literally said, "Oh shit," out loud. This was a track that seemed to communicate a sense of, like, immediately present danger that carried a level of high-stakes urgency that none of their previous stuff has in the same way. As if to say, something is deeply wrong with the world right now and something needs to be done about it right now. I can kinda see where a certain other critic on this platform might have gotten a Stranger Things comparison out of it, since even if it does not have that kind of like 80s synthwave Tangerine Dream-ish feel for that comparison to have come to my mind, it would certainly fit well as, you know, like, the opening theme to a TV show about a group of kids fighting against some kind of, like, supernatural, existential, world-ending threat. I could maybe see some John Carpenter-ish parallels if I squint at it. In any case, it was a great track. And yeah, now we have the full album. The discourse has been discoursing. We got both veteran fans and newbies talking about how it's either one of the best albums ever made in all of history, or how it's a big disappointment that doesn't deserve this much hype. No real correlation between how in-depth people are in the electronic music world and how much those people actually enjoyed the experience, from what I can tell. And as for me personally, I am on the side of thinking the album was great. I'm not going to say it's suddenly one of my favorite albums ever made or anything. I don't think BOC are delivering anything game-changing here, but I can comfortably call it my third favorite of their albums overall. Not as good as their first two classics, but definitely better than Campfire, Headphase, and Tomorrow's Harvest. And certainly a fair bit closer in quality to GeoGaddy than I would have expected. I can even see why I've seen some people calling this their best album to date, even over the big classics. Prophecy at 1420 MHz fittingly turned out to be a pretty indicative look of what this entire album was about. The whole project is kinda like a cross between GeoGaddy and Campfire Headphase, and it really leans into their darker and more experimental side and gets it to feel higher stakes and more urgent, at least by their standards. With tracks that one could say are better textured or at least more easily accessible than those on GeoGaddy through the addition of more guitars and acoustic instrumentation and stuff. Now, by no means is the album perfect. I do think the second half of the album is a fair bit stronger than the first half, and one advantage that GeoGaddy very clearly has over this album is the interludes. Hearing both albums in close proximity to each other, I think may have been the first time I actually understood the semi-common take I'd seen people had that GeoGaddy's interludes were better than their longer tracks, since so many of those little minute-long moments are really iconic, or at least add something interesting, and the interlude game on Inferno, by comparison, isn't even close to as memorable. The interludes here are better than on Campfire Headphase, where they were barely even a factor at all, but they are nearly all extremely outclassed by the longer tracks, and none of the interludes are highlights for me. I feel like even the interludes on Tomorrow's Harvest may have been better, or at least had more tracks that could qualify as semi-memorable highlights like Gemini, Telepath, and You Ritual. This album, by comparison, feels like it was adding interludes almost as a quota to fill, and they're all tracks that just kinda exist and don't really grab my attention. You got a generally pleasant synth intro called Introit, which is like the generic stereotype of what I would expect a Boards of Canada interlude to sound like. I can at least easily remember what it sounds like, but I don't know if that would be the case if it weren't literally the first thing you hear on the album. You got some impressionistic guitar pads called Somewhere Right Now in the Future that disappears from my head immediately after it's done. You got some rumbling sound effects called Acts of Magic. And magic isn't even spelled with a K for the easy extra satanic cult imagery. What are we doing here? The Black Dog would have gotten that right. We got a mildly pleasant collection of warm synth pads called Memory Death, which is still no over-the-horizon radar, and we got an inessential synth outro called I Saw Through Platonia, which does maybe feel like a little bit of a callback to, I think, the intro of Campfire Headphase, but otherwise feels kind of tacked on and unnecessary, especially feeling like a drop in emotional stakes considering the track that comes immediately before it, which we'll get to. Also, if you want to stretch the definition of interlude, you could theoretically add on The Process, which that feels more like two interludes stitched together. That is probably the closest an interlude on this album comes to being a proper highlight. If only because of the second half of the track, which switches over into these really nice melancholy piano progressions that remind me a little of Diving Station, and I think hit an even deeper note than that track. If that bit were all on its own, that would be a highlight, although the track's first half of, foreboding field recordings, which sounds kind of like a distant angry mob with some female, almost text-to-speech voice layered on top, is just kind of whatever. Still, even if this album's interludes can occasionally feel like almost something of a contractual obligation to make it feel more Boards of Canada-ish without actually elevating the experience as they can on old albums of theirs, they obviously don't take up a significant amount of the album's running time or actively weigh down the experience. It's an aspect to this album that prevents me from saying the album's on par with GeoGaddy, but it's not like that's saying much. For the most part, the longer tracks on the album are clearly the main focus, and the majority of these are winners, frequently carrying a level of heaviness and emotional intensity that I don't often expect out of these guys. A lot more so in the second half than in the first half, but the first half still has its share of highlights too. I already talked about how big a home run the opener was for me, but Hydrogen, Helium, Lithium, Leviathan is a comparably strong follow-up to it. Floating through lots of foggier pads and building into this particularly heavy beat with all these strikingly stabby bass lines, which are really cool. Also quite like the occasional subtle bell and horn textures in the background of some parts. That was definitely a big highlight every time I put this thing on. A track like Naraka, meanwhile, required a few listens for it to really start clicking with me. The fairly minimal, not really tribal beats and the Indian chanting samples didn't initially strike me as among the most interesting of mixes here, though it did grow on me over time. The chanting does make for a nice, foreboding melodic hook, and the Pete standing alone style chords in the beginning are pretty emotive as well. So I did grow to call that one a highlight, I think. We also got a track like Age of Capricorn, which seems to be going down as a big fan favorite, although I admittedly wasn't as grabbed by what this track was doing as pretty much everyone else seems to be. The rhythmic voice samples of someone listing out random letters in the background are neat, and the building synth progressions are relatively deep and immersive. I can appreciate what it does in album context and, furthering the whole cultish vibe, especially in the track's second half with these narrations vaguely promising some kind of spiritual enlightenment that you're not entirely sure if you can trust. It is still a good track, it just didn't really pop out to me in the same way that many of my actual favorite tracks here did. What did maybe pop out to me a bit more was the track Father and Son, which seems to be a bit of a divisive one in the track listing. The instrumental backdrop is a fairly plain, if mildly eerie, low-key hip-hop beat with some electric piano melodies that sort of call old tracks of theirs like Turquoise Hexagon Sun or Alpha and Omega to mind. But the real reason this track stuck out was all the various vocal samples plastered on top. They sound like they were cut out of a podcast or something and digitally sped up and slowed down to match the beat and occasionally digitally warped as to become completely incomprehensible. If you found this track annoying, I would understand. On first listen, I did find some of the digital artifacts around the most incomprehensible bits to kind of throw me off. It had me briefly wondering whether the AI generated some of those voices, but also the way those noise artifacts were implemented felt too intentional for that worry to stick in my mind beyond the first listen. It sounds more like they were intentionally stretching and filtering those voices to sound worse and more uncanny, which that is something they would do. Personally, I like the track. It adds some extra flavor and variety to the album. I think it's wonderful, or whatever, but fair enough if this moment lost some people. But okay, the first half of this track listing is good, but once we hit the track The Word Becomes Flesh, I feel like the album just elevates itself to a new height and delivers nothing but top-tier hitters from them, all the way through to the end, excluding the outro. The next three tracks all kind of form a mini trilogy of tracks that sort of seem to loosely echo their ideas off each other and kind of run together as if they were one track, but still feeling distinct in their own right. The Word Becomes Flesh itself starts out with some low-key beatwork and eerie melodic stabs that add up to a fairly mysterious vibe, but they just seem to keep building up momentum and heaviness over time, adding on thicker beats and bass lines, chopping up more voice samples about embryos and developing fetuses or whatever, to turn them into functional rap verses that get run through vocoders every few bars. That one would keep grabbing my attention, get me more hyped up anytime it came up. And that momentum is maintained into the next track, Into the Magic Land, that brings back some of those old Campfire Headface post-rocky vibes, albeit once again applying all its more layered guitar textures on top of the mysterious synth builds for a track that feels much darker and creepier than anything actually on Campfire Headface. One of the album's more evocative and melodic cuts, also like that little middle section has a bunch of xylophones and strings in the background. But my favorite in this mini-trilogy has to be Blood in the Labyrinth, which starts out with some really haunting and chilling ambience before building some classic trip-hop beats on top, melodically feeling both rather sad but also kinda scary. And also really kicking into high gear about a minute and a half in when all these sitar melodies come in on top. That's one of the most striking moments for the album as a whole. And that leads pretty well into Deep Time. I may not have known what to think of this track when it first dropped as the Tape 05 teaser, but hearing it in full context of the album got it to click with me way more than it ever did out of context. Being surrounded by so many tracks that have this much darker and more foreboding atmosphere allows this track's much more peaceful and faux heavenly atmosphere to stand out all the more and feel like a really important key moment for the album as a whole rather than just like a glorified interlude. Especially again the orchestral bits in the second half of the track, which as it turns out were one of the most emotionally powerful bits of the whole album, who would have guessed? I do kind of wish the track had a better title than Deep Time. That feels like what I would imagine your typical surface-level fan who doesn't know any other electronic artists besides Boards of Canada is thinking to themselves when they put this on. Oh yeah, it's Deep Time. It's time for something deep, bro. But whatever, I'll still take it. Anyway, after that, it's right back into the dark and mysterious depths with following track, All Reason Departs. This was another track that didn't click with me on first listen, but really grew on me a lot the more times I put it on. There are a lot of passages of this track, especially over the second half, that focus on nothing but fairly minimal tribal beatwork that just kind of drone on with occasional evolving acid effects. Reminds me a lot of something Muslim gauze would do, and that is neat. But also the track's first half has a lot more chilling and icy melodic passages and foreboding filtered vocal samples about ritualistic sacrifice or whatever, which even further the dramatic effects. And speaking of dramatic, one of the album's loudest and most intense tracks, Arena Americanada, comes right after that. Okay, it's not, like, way louder than most of the album, and the end of the track does float out into, like, a lot of relatively peaceful ambient pads. But the core of the track is back to the same level of intensity that tracks at the beginning of the album, like Hydrogen, Helium, Lithium, Leviathan, were sitting at. Melodically, it feels marginally more triumphant and positive, if still fairly shaky and insecure. Got more stabbing 80s bass lines to go up next to its brighter chords and thicker beats. Feels fairly flashy by the standards of this album and lives up to the vibe promised by the title as much as a Boards of Canada production reasonably can. Feels like the kind of thing that could score some kind of bloody gladiator battle being watched from a very far distance where you can't fully make out what's going on, but you can tell it's not pretty, and there's still bright lights and a crowd cheering it on anyway. But that leaves one last track to talk about, the functional closer, You Retreat in Time and Space. I won't leave you in suspense, this is my favorite track on the album and it is not particularly close. I think it may already earn a spot among my top 5 or even top 3 favorite Boards of Canada tracks ever. The first half of the track focuses on lots more chilling ambience, which features none of the underlying foreboding creepiness that many of the other ambient passages throughout the album have, but instead feel very sad, like you're in the presence of the ghost of a lost loved one or something. But as the track actually builds into a real groove with proper bass lines, electric pianos, more absolutely gorgeous ambient melodies, and guitars swirling around before the trip-hop beats start to take form around them, in one breath, it recaptures the same kind of dreamlike vibe that my favorite Boards of Canada track, Roy G. Biv, has. That kind of ray of hope through sadness sort of feeling. But more importantly, the second half of this track just sounds like something the band Air would make. Like some Moon Safari type shit, especially with some of those bass lines. And for the new viewers who are not familiar with my taste, the band Air are like properly one of my top 10 favorite musical acts of all time. They were one of the bands that first got me obsessed with electronic music when I was a literal preteen child, and they are way, way more formative to my tastes than Boards of Canada ever were. So I cannot pull out comparisons to Air's Moon Safari lightly. That shit got me right in the childhood and legit got me to tear up on several listens, especially that one little bit right around the 3.5-minute mark where these absolutely freaking gorgeous flutes slip into the mix before those two little subtle foghorn-like bass synth players. Like, oh my god. 13 years of waiting may have just been worth it entirely for this one track. The rest of the album may take you through quite the dark and heavy and bleak journey, but what a spiritual release right at the end there. And the fact that track with such an otherwise hopeful tone being called You Retreat in Time and Space makes it feel even more profound. Again, kind of like saying goodbye to a loved one who has passed on. This track being so inhumanly good is also kind of why I think the outro could have potentially just been cut, but again, it's not the end of the world, it's fine. So there we go. That's finally everything to go through in Inferno. Yeah, that was great. Again, this is not one of my new favorite albums of all time or anything. They're not delivering anything I haven't heard before, and if some people found this to be meandering and tedious, I would understand. But I also equally understand the people to whom this was the best Boards of Canada album to date. Where an album like GeoGaddy may have the tone of some kind of like hidden dark conspiracy in the background only hinted at through the subtly foreboding moods, Inferno feels like it's putting that dark conspiracy in front of your face in a way that you can't ignore, getting even darker and more foreboding than this duo already was, and making that mood again feel really urgent, like something really bad is on the verge of happening at all times, not unlike the mood of the world in general right now. And in that less subtle approach, I feel like they're also making their sound more accessible and easier to emotionally engage with. Even if that emotion is doom and gloom most of the time, it's being presented in a way that feels pretty consistently exciting for me across the full 70 minutes. I may still prefer Music Has the Right to Children and GeoGaddy, not just for shallow nostalgia reasons, but also because those albums feel more indicative of what I specifically come to Boards of Canada for in particular. Creating equally impressive, if not even more impressive, musical world building out of moments that feel much smaller and more subtle and more lo-fi. The interludes on this album being mostly shrug-worthy for me, I think, may have helped me even further appreciate just how iconic the interludes are on GeoGaddy. But while GeoGaddy feels more out of the box and creative, especially for the time when it was released, I have also always maintained like a level of emotional distance from that album, and I still do. It was the kind of album that I needed a long time to grow on me, where Inferno felt way more immediate. The kind of thing I pretty much got right on first listen, and I pretty much got the exact same level of enjoyment out of every time I have put it on over the past, week and a half now? I may still have my structural issues. The stretch from Age of Capricorn to Memory Death, while still good, is less impactful for me than the very beginning and the entire second half after that. But hey, I'm mainly just happy to hear an album generate this insane level of hype on name recognition alone, and instead of being irritated that people are only listening to the obvious popular names instead of putting in more effort to find even better stuff, I came out of this actually feeling like, no, you know what, I feel it. It might even be my favorite album of the year so far. Although, barely, if that. I think my previous frontrunner was the Black Dogs Loud Ambient 2, which was also great and I get a comparable level of enjoyment out of for completely different reasons. I could very easily see something else coming up this year that ends up unseating both of them. Also, if this had come out last year, I don't think it would have even made my top 10 favorites of that year, which is more of a statement on how much great electronic music came out in 2025 than it is on the quality of this album. Go check out the albums from my top 10 from last year. Most of them got really overlooked. One of them's on my t-shirt today. This is Anamoya by Yarny. Doesn't sound anything like Boards of Canada, but it's overlooked. Go check it out. But also, if Inferno had come out last year, it probably would have gotten a spot in that top 20. And if it had come out any year, like, before 2025, it probably would have just been a year-end list contender anyway, so yeah. I obviously don't need to recommend this one. If you watch this channel, you have already heard it. There's pretty much no chance you haven't heard it yet at this point. But if you were curious about how much I personally enjoyed it, I enjoyed it quite a bit. and I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.